Bibliophiles of the internet. Today I'm here to share about all the books I read for round 14 of the Queer Lit Read-a-thon. If you're not familiar with the Queer Lit Read-a-thon, they typically have 2 full rounds per year, both in June and December, and it's a week-long reading event that encourages folks to just focus in on queer books. It was created by the incredible Kathy and Rogan, who I will have linked down below, and I will have all the information for the readathon included in the description as well if you would like to learn some more. Their most recent winter round just happened from December 15th to the 21st. It was an incredible reading week for me. I somehow read, I believe, 9 books, and I had a great time with all of them, so let's just get into it. The first book I finished was actually my December Patreon pick, and my patrons voted for me to read my arc of Murder by Memory by Olivia Waite. This is a 2025 release. It comes out from Tor.com on March 18th. This is a queer, cozy sci-fi mystery set in space. It takes place on a generation ship called the HMS Fairweather, where they have basically perfected eternal life and the reincarnation process. They have technology that allows them to save people's memories and genomes in books, and once people pass away, they're able to use that data to install someone's consciousness into a new body and essentially bring them back to life. The story begins when one of the ship's detectives, Dorothy, suddenly wakes up in a body that doesn't belong to her, and she discovers that she's been awakened because people are not only turning up dead, but the killer is also purposefully deleting their minds from the library itself. Content warnings for death, references to sibling death and grief, and some explorations of memory loss. This was such a great way to kick off my week. It was so much fun to read. Just a really great sci-fi mystery condensed into this little bite-sized package. It's like the novella equivalent of an amuse-bouche, just enough to give you a little taste of the ecosystem on this generation ship, the new norms that come with this technology, and what we might be able to expect if this story expands into a series, which I really hope it does. As I said in the synopsis, I would definitely classify this as a cozy mystery in the sense that it's somewhat lower stakes. It's not very action forward, it doesn't have that sort of thriller intensity that you might expect from a traditional detective story, and that's totally fine because that's not what the story is trying to be. There is still a central mystery. Dorothy is still gradually uncovering clues and finding different pieces of the puzzle to help solve the case, but there's not really a sense of danger driving the story so much as a moral urgency to help protect the other passengers aboard this generation ship. And related to that, one of my favorite pieces of this story is seeing how Olivia Waite has reimagined society and social norms in this futuristic setting. It's really fascinating to see how this society approaches public safety, crime, the accumulation of wealth, class discrepancies, and so on and so forth, especially because this access to what is essentially eternal life inherently affects the dynamics and politics of all of those things. It was really refreshing to read about a justice system that's structured so differently from our own, and to see how even as a detective, Dorothy herself is not necessarily an authoritative figure in that system, but rather just a small piece. Again, overall, I really enjoyed this. Dorothy kind of discovers a love interest slash potential Watson to her Sherlock towards the end, which is what makes me hope that this will eventually expand into a series. If you know how I feel about the Masa and Pleiti series, you know I love some sapphic sleuths in space, so I sincerely hope this is not the last we see of Dorothy Gentleman. I gave this 4.5 stars. I counted this book towards 2 prompts. First, past, present, future, because I feel like the ecosystem on this generation ship captures all 3 of those elements, what with preserving people's minds and bringing them back to life. And I also counted it towards the gifted prompt, since I read from a review copy that was gifted to me by the publisher. After that, I picked up a graphic novel that I actually mentioned in my recent Queer Lit Read-a-thon bingo board recommendations video. That was I Shall Never Fall in Love by Harry Connor. This is a queer historical romance, very Jane Austen inspired. It's about a trans-masc non-binary character named George who's recently inherited their family's failing estate. And on top of that, they're also working through their gender presentation and their very confusing feelings for their best friend, Eleanor. Eleanor has always wanted to do the right thing by her family and fall in love with a marriageable man, but she's never felt that way about anyone, and with her father's ailing health, she's content to stay in the family home and take care of him. But when a new suitor comes to town and infiltrates her friend group, she begins to feel oddly threatened and will have to confront feelings about George that she never knew she had. Content warnings for references to parental death, some experiences of misgendering and dead naming, as well as experienced racism and references to the slave trade. This was also such a fun time. It's not only an exploration and celebration of how people across the world and across time periods have always found ways to live in their queerness and their transness, but it's also a refreshing twist on a period romance. Historical fiction about queer and trans characters is not a new thing, obviously, but I think there's so much to be said for when those stories are told in graphic format, because it's one thing to intellectually know that trans people specifically have always existed existed, but to actually see what that looks like and what queer and trans desirability looks like on the page is truly invaluable in ways that I can't really express. Besides the romantic plot lines and the queer representation, I appreciate that this story is also confronting issues of privilege, especially across race and class. The three main friends in the story all have vastly different experiences in society, and while all of them are being pressured to secure advantageous marriages for themselves, that pressure and what they can realistically expect from marriage or lack thereof looks completely different for each of them. Because of that, they don't always see eye to eye about their prospects, or again, lack thereof, and they don't always understand why their friends make the choices they do, which causes confusion and tension in their friend group. In that way, I appreciate what the story has to say about how intention is not the equivalent of impact, and how even though it's a natural instinct to want to help people we love and make their lives easier, we also have to trust that people know themselves and know what they need better than we do. And sometimes we just have to get out of our own way and let people make the best choices they can for themselves. On a different note, I also have to say I thought the comedic timing in this graphic novel was so spot on. It has some genuinely laugh out loud moments that are so amusing to read. And I also thought the panel composition helped to capture queer desire in a palpable and dynamic way. I did find one of the main characters to be a little bit grating, and it does take a while for her to grow and change her ways, but overall I still enjoyed this and I gave it 4.5 stars. I also counted this for 2 prompts. First, the graphic prompt for obvious reasons, and also the high hype, no hype prompt, since this has very little hype considering that it's a fairly recent release. This next book was not originally part of my plan going into this round of the Queer Lit Read-a-thon, but my friend Megan on Instagram, who I'll link down below, posted a review that gave me the push to finally request it from my library, so once I got that hold in, I just committed to it. That was The Safekeep by Yael van der Voeten. This is a queer historical story set in the Dutch countryside during the summer of 1961. It's about a young woman named Isabel whose mother passed away and whose brothers have both left their childhood home behind, so she's the only one left to tend to the family house. She's very strict and disciplined about how she runs the house because she's trying to preserve what her mother built for them after the war, but her orderly routine is disrupted when her older brother Louis has to leave the country for work and drops off his new girlfriend, Ava, at the family home to stay as a long-term guest in his absence. Isabel finds Ava absolutely infuriating and also begins to notice small things disappearing around the house the longer she stays, and eventually her suspicion spirals into obsession and eventually even forbidden desire. Content warnings for references to parental death and grief, some descriptions of sexual harassment and non-consensual touch, references to World War II trauma, the Holocaust, and anti-Semitism, experiences of infidelity, some internalized xenophobia, and some explicit sexual content. This was a wild ride from start to finish. I read it in 2 sittings across 2 days, and I just could not look away from these horrifically messy sapphics, which I say as the absolute highest compliment. I think this just works on so many levels, especially because of the time period in which it's set, which is right after the end of World War II, when so many people were struggling to reestablish a sense of normalcy and security in their lives. And in a way, that struggle was futile because the concepts of normalcy and safety were forever altered by the war itself. But that informs so much of Isabel's character because she is so strict and rigid in the way she runs the family home, because she thinks she can preserve the house and everything it represents for her family if she can just control it. The irony, of course, being that because she is a woman, she can't actually have ownership over the house. It made me think a lot about how women especially often take on the role of the memory keeper for their families in so many ways, and how they're then criticized for clinging on to the past or not knowing how to let things go, when there's actually a great deal of value in remembering where we come from, or attempting to remember where we come from. I think this story is really exploring that tension and also showing how memory, by definition, will always be imperfect because it has limitations, and because the nature of memory itself is highly malleable and often shapeshifts depending on framing and context. So that was a really fascinating part of the story, how in many ways Isabel is desperately fighting to stand still so she can preserve the stability and safety her family was able to find after the war, and how her strict routine keeps her out of the public eye and almost allows her to hide herself away so as as not to draw attention to the very thing she's fighting to preserve. And that's what makes this wild, illicit affair with her brother's girlfriend so dynamic, so impossible to look away from, because it's a rabid departure from Isabel's carefully controlled and curated sense of self. It's a violent break in her norm that forces her to discard her carefully curated boundaries. And that element of the forbidden ties into the greater thematic work the story is doing, especially in regards to the house, which Isabel covets in so many ways, despite the fact that she's merely a placeholder in its ownership across the years. I just found this to be a beautifully crafted, propulsive story that has so much to offer in terms of reflecting on the burdens we willingly take upon ourselves and the all-too-human instinct to try and live up to impossible expectations that have far-reaching implications we often lack the imagination to even truly understand. There were two minor things that kept this from being a 5-star book for me. First is that there were so many cut off or disrupted sentences, which worked in some scenes, but eventually began to grate against the flow of the story and became so redundant and exhausting to read. The second is that the ending almost feels like something out of a romance, which isn't inherently a bad thing. I love a good romance, but especially because of the turn the story takes towards the end, I was hoping it would maintain that sort of frenzied intensity up to the end, but instead it just loses steam and switches tact. I still really enjoyed this though. In fact, I pre-ordered the paperback edition that's coming out in May, so I would still definitely recommend it. It is absolutely wild, but in the best possible way, and I gave it 4.5 stars. This book also covered 2 prompts. Firstly, the disaster queers prompt, because there is no better descriptor for these 2 unhinged queer women, and also the food prompt, not only because there's food on the cover, but because food and fruit especially are important imagery and metaphorical elements in the story. After that, I picked up my e-arc of The Build a Boyfriend Project by Mason Deaver, which comes out from Avon Books on August 5th. This is Mason's debut adult romance. It's about a trans man and aspiring journalist named Eli who's not only stuck working as an executive assistant for a popular online publication, but he was also recently dumped by his boyfriend of 7 years, who also happens to be his coworker. His friends and family are encouraging him to get back on the horse, put himself back out there, and he lets his best friend set him up with a friend of a friend of a friend, only to be subjected to a truly horrific first date. The next day, he's talking about it in the office and his boss overhears and proposes that Eli go back out with this guy, Peter, take him on a series of dates, try to teach him to be a better boyfriend, and then write an article about it. And if he can do that, he'll be promoted from assistant to staff writer, which is what he wants. So he agrees, embarks on this fake relationship with Peter, all the while secretly planning to turn in a different article where he interviews Peter about what it's like growing up queer in the South, what it's like to be a queer person of color, and the difficulties of dating as a queer adult. And clearly, nothing will go wrong with any of these plans. Content warnings for references to parental death and explorations of grief, descriptions of experienced homophobia, transphobia, and racism, descriptions of dysphoria, brief references to conversion therapy experienced by a secondary character, and some explicit sexual content. Mason Deaver is so fucking back, baby, and I love it so much. To be clear, they never left and they have never once disappointed me, but this adult romance puts them back on the map in a major way, and I am so excited to finally have their voice in this space. If I had to say one thing about this book, it's that it's so stinking adorable. Like, yes, it does have this very zany, fun, fake dating premise, but the 2 main characters themselves have such incredible natural chemistry, and their budding relationship is just so soft and sweet. I think everything in this story hangs together so perfectly because the concept of second chances is reflected in every single aspect of the story, from the thematic work to the plot itself. Not only is Eli essentially forced to give Peter a second chance to redeem himself after their truly horrific first date, but both Eli and Peter are navigating what it means to have a second chance at life in so many ways. For Peter, as someone who grew up having to be closeted throughout their early adolescence, he's finally getting a chance to live openly and experience all the firsts that so many people often get to experience much earlier in life. And as a trans man, Eli can also relate to that because he grew up having a lot of important milestones and making foundational memories in a body and in a presentation that doesn't align with his sense of self. And in a lot of ways, now that he's transitioned, he's experiencing the world for the first time in a completely new way. I love that connection, that theme of second chances being woven throughout the story, and because of that, it's just a beautiful love letter to queer adults and trans adults who not only have to start over later in life, but who are denied the opportunity to find and access community when they need it the most. So often, there's not a blueprint for how to find and connect with other queer people, especially as adults, and especially when you don't know how or where to access safe spaces. So many queer and trans adults who are starting over have to bumble their way through these different experiences on their own, just hoping for the best. And this story tells us that it doesn't have to be that way, which I think is such an important message. And I think part of what makes this relationship so endearing to me is not only that both characters work really hard to make it safe and to establish clear boundaries, but because through their connection, both characters are almost getting a chance to feed and heal their inner child, in a sense. Especially Peter, because Eli is a bit more experienced, and he's able to guide Peter through these experiences with the gentleness, grace, and thoughtfulness that he didn't get to experience himself. Honestly, I just don't have a single bad thing to say about this. It made me smile so much and hope so much. It's laugh out loud funny. It's full of these really fun fake dates. It's deeply romantic and also steamy in ways that cishet romances could never pull off. It's just absolutely wonderful, and I couldn't not give it 5 stars. I counted this towards the community prompt because I think this story is a love letter to not only building queer community, but also about the isolation that comes from being denied access to community. So I think that fits. And it also fits into the gifted prompt since I was gifted a review copy from Avon Books. Then keeping on the debut adult romance train, I picked up I Think They Love You by Julian Winters, which comes out from St. Martin's Griffin on January 28th. This, like I said, is Julian's adult romance debut. It's about Denz, whose father is the CEO of an extremely luxe and lucrative company that specializes in designing and organizing special events. And much to Denz's surprise, he's also recently announced his retirement. It's a family-owned and operated business, so a lot of Denz's family members have their eyes on that CEO position, but he also wants to throw his own hat into the ring. The problem is that no one in his family actually takes him seriously, namely because, in their own words, he won't even commit to a long-term relationship. Of course, the obvious solution to his work problem is to lie and say that he is in fact in a serious, committed relationship, and now he just needs to find a fake boyfriend to bring to a few family functions and make it look convincing. He tries to enlist his best friend and roommate Jamie, but when Jamie is a no-show, Denz has to improvise with the closest person he can find, which happens to be Braylon, his ex. Content warnings for references to parental death and grief, brief mentions of experienced racism, some descriptions of panic attacks, and some explicit sexual content. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. Julian Winters never disappoints. Even though this is his first adult romance, it is so aggressively his brand, and all the incredible things you know and love about his YA writing absolutely shine through in this story, albeit in new ways. If there's one thing Julian's always gonna do, he will always write a tender, warm-hearted, thoughtful story about what it means to not only discover yourself, but to be okay with continuously discovering new things about yourself. And that's exactly what you get from this story. I really respect the ways the story challenges the social norm of using romantic relationships, or lack thereof, as a viable barometer for success. The fact that Denz has to stage a fake relationship to show his family that he's a serious person is inherently ridiculous. And while he does mistakenly buy into that for most of the story, by the end I think he has a much clearer picture of himself and is beginning to realize that what he has to offer on his own as himself is actually more than enough. That's a message I deeply value and that I think so many people need to hear. Oftentimes, it's not that we need romance or these other external milestones to quote-unquote improve our lives or prove that our lives have value. It's that we need more chances to stand in our own power and to be trusted. I think that's what Denz is really struggling with in the story. He's sort of trapped in this self-fulfilling prophecy where he's not taken seriously because people in his life don't see him as having that capacity, and as such never give him the chance to prove that conception wrong, which is what keeps him from growing in the first place. So I really appreciate that part of the story. I deeply respect how it shows that it's not our job titles, our achievements, or how much money we make that defines our success, but rather how we love and support and show up for the people in our lives, including ourselves. I also like how Julian establishes and explores this second chance romance between Denz and Braylon. It can be hard to establish chemistry and history with a relationship that both began and ended before the story even starts, but I thought there was a great use of flashback interludes to build out that history in effective ways. I do kind of feel like the fake dating situationship between Denz and Braylon is a little bit lower stakes than I typically enjoy in my fake dating romances, which is not inherently a bad thing, it's just something that I noticed. Overall, I really enjoyed this. I thought the story was able to effectively nail those thematic concepts and bring everything together in the end in a way that was emotionally cathartic and satisfying. If you love adult romance, I think you're gonna love what Julian is bringing to that space. I gave this 4.5 stars. In terms of prompts, this once again counted towards the gifted prompt because I read from a gifted review copy. I'm also, perhaps controversially, counting it for winter holiday because the big event that Dens has to coordinate as part of his bid for CEO is a Valentine's Day event. And at least here in the Northern Hemisphere, Valentine's Day does in fact take place during the winter months. After that, I finally got a chance to pick up A Guest in the House by E.M. Carroll. This is an adult horror graphic novel about Abby, who recently got married to a widowed dentist who just moved to town with his daughter after his first wife's passing. And as she tries to settle into her new life, she begins learning more and more about her husband's first marriage. The more she learns about his first wife, the more she begins questioning things and wondering whether she truly died due to natural causes. The more Abby questions and investigates, the more the first wife's memory seems to become a sentient force, a ghostly entity that Abby might just find herself falling for. Content warnings for explorations of parental death and grief, mentions of suicide and allusions to suicidal thoughts, and references to past verbal abuse and domestic abuse. This is such a stunning, viscerally crafted, perfectly composed graphic novel. The technical components of the storytelling are simply second to none and make this comic such an immersive and unforgettable reading experience. The style of illustration and the composition of the panels are so perfectly suited to the tone of the story, which is very somber, mysterious, and dark. The story is so creepy, so desolate, and Abby's narration comes from someone who feels so empty inside. And that's why the use of white space, and more importantly, black space, is so incredibly effective. E.M. Carroll in all their work displays such a great natural instinct for when to use panels in their graphic stories and when to let the sequential art bleed into itself and defy those conventions of linear temporality. And that is once again on full display in this book. So especially when things are getting dark and creepy, the panels in the comic, which are implemented to create structure and convey the linear passage of time, disappear, which makes everything feel surreal and dreamlike. That's what I mean when I talk about the composition of the art in relation to how the story is being told and how it's meant to make the reader feel. And that is executed to perfection, in my opinion. Thematically, I also really love what the story is doing because it's paralleling this storyline of Abby becoming more and more inclined to believe their lakeside home is being haunted by her husband's ex-wife to the way that she feels like a ghost haunting herself in many ways. The same way that Abby has locked away her queerness in a dark corner of her mind that she can't reach, she's also tried to bury the suspicions she has of her new husband and whether he's been truthful about what happened to his last wife. The evidence is there if only she were brave enough to look. There's a really great interplay between what's real and what's not real, connected to how Abby doesn't feel like a real person inhabiting her own life. And that's what makes this crossover between the corporeal world and the non-corporeal world so interesting to read. This is a really compelling, dark, messed up story that's told in such a deeply visceral way. The use of composition and the very intentional use of color really helps to convey the story's feeling of dread and wonder. I do think it ends a little bit abruptly, but that's a very minor note. I highly recommend this, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Obviously, this is a graphic novel, so I could have counted it towards the graphic prompt, but I really read it to fulfill the ghosts prompt. That was the last book I had officially planned to read for the week, so I got to hit some TBR stretch goals after that, starting with my arc of But Not Too Bold by Hachipueo, which comes out from Tor.com on February 11th. This is a sort of gothic horror story blended together with a sapphic monster romance. It's about this mysterious house in South America where the lady of the house, named Anathema, is a humanoid spider known for feasting on her human brides. Dahlia is the new keeper of the keys in the house whose predecessor was just killed, and now she has to take up her duties of locking and unlocking the drawers where Anathema keeps her memories. If Dahlia can unravel the crime that led to her predecessor's death, then she might just survive long enough to grow into her new role and also figure out her relationship with her mistress. Content warnings for some instances of death and violence. I enjoyed this, but I didn't love it. And to be perfectly clear, I am very much the target audience for a story like this, a creepy gothic story set in Latin America with a sapphic romance between a human and a spider monster. But while I enjoyed the story's aesthetics, I just didn't find it to have much substance. The strongest element of this novella is definitely its thematic work. It's really exploring what it means to be overlooked, to be relegated to the background, not because you're invisible, but because people do not want to see you, and how powerful it is to be seen fully for all your wondrous parts and your monstrous parts. I really respect that undertaking in the story and appreciate how the two main characters both share in that feeling of invisibility, and yet they're two extremes on opposite ends of the spectrum. Lady Anathema is too frightening, too overwhelming, too bold, if I can reference the title, and Dahlia, on the other hand, is merely a cog in this very complex machine whose position isn't so much about drawing attention, but rather seamlessly performing day-to-day tasks. So even though they both share in that experience, that feeling of not being seen or not being understood to the fullest, they're coming at it from two very different places. Because of that, their relationship and how the story is building up to that relationship does provide a sense of emotional catharsis, but personally, I didn't get much else from it besides that. And I think that's an extension of how I felt about the rest of the story. I thought there were some really cool pieces to it, but I don't feel like all those pieces were putting in the work they should have been. I don't think they were all meaningfully adding to the story so much as just being interesting set dressing. I think it was an interesting thought experiment, but it left me wanting more on multiple fronts. I would definitely read more from this author though, and I hope that Tor does plan to publish more of her work. I gave this a solid 3 stars. This once again counted for the gifted prompt, and I also put it towards the magic prompt because not only is Anathema part of an ancient magical species, but the miniature memories she stores in her drawers are also imbued with magic. So I say it counts. Penultimately, I decided this would be a great chance to finally listen to Most Ardently by Gabe Cole-Navoa. The audiobook is absolutely sensational and read by Harrison Knights. This is part of Macmillan's Remixed Classic series, which is a series where marginalized authors take classic stories and reinterpret them based on their own cultural lens and lived experiences. This one happens to be a queer and trans twist on Pride and Prejudice. In this version of the story, we're following Oliver Bennett, a young closeted trans boy who is forced to present himself in society as Elizabeth, and whose family unfortunately is set on making him someone's wife. His only respite is when he sneaks out of his family home dressed as the young gentleman he truly is, and stealing these precious moments as himself out in society. On one such occasion, he runs into Fitzwilliam Darcy, who actually slighted him at a recent ball when he was introduced as Elizabeth. But away from the prying eyes of the ton, Oliver is learning that Darcy might also be hiding away his innermost self, and that he's much different than Oliver first thought. Content warnings for descriptions of dysphoria, dead naming, and misgendering, brief instance of outing in regards to a supporting character, descriptions of experienced transphobia, sexism, and misogyny, and some non-graphic allusions to suicidal thoughts. It was so good to finally get to this. I've been trying to read it all year long. It might have taken me almost an entire calendar year, but we did it, folks. Before I say anything about the story itself, I really want to reiterate that the audiobook is such a treat. It's so wonderful to listen to. Harrison Knights is a trans voice actor, and he brings so much to this story. His narration is immersive, engaging, personable, and just so enjoyable. So if you're an audiobook person, I highly recommend that format. If there's one thing you need to know about me, it's that I can always go for Pride and Prejudice retelling. I love that story so much. I think it can be reimagined in so many exciting ways. So to have a trans author putting a trans twist on this familiar classic was so special to read. What I appreciate about this remix is that there's a clear amount of reverence being paid to the original in the way the story is told, from the structure to the story beats and even some quotes. But what's great is that at the same time, even though the familiar shape of the story is still there, it still finds new places to take the narrative and the characters. There are entirely new scenes and settings and plot wrinkles that we've never seen before. For example, without giving anything away, the villain of Pride and Prejudice is still the villain in this story, but they're villainous in completely different ways. I also appreciate how this story brings a little more depth to Darcy's character. In the original, he's very haughty, standoffish, and distant, and it takes quite a while for Lizzie to understand why he conducts himself that way. But because Oliver gets to spend time with Darcy outside of public society, we understand why he acts the way he does. And I really like the parallel between Oliver and Darcy's situations. They're both forced to hide away an important part of themselves. They're both expected to present themselves a certain way, and that makes them both feel deeply resentful and hinders them from putting their best foot forward in public. I do think there were some missed opportunities in this remix. First and foremost, I wish we got to see Oliver and Darcy spending more time together. In the original story, the societal convention of women not being able to spend time alone with men prevents Lizzie from getting to spend time with Darcy outside of public events, which is why he comes off so aloof. But as two young men, Oliver and Darcy have more freedom to be together, and yet we don't really get to see that. And the other main thing is that even though I like how the story ended, it didn't make me feel satisfied. And that's because I think a lot of those twists, resolutions, and relationship developments especially felt somewhat underdeveloped. My copy is just under 300 pages, and I think that lack of space did a disservice to how those final scenes played out. It's not that the content itself was bad, it's just that it needed more space to breathe. Also, kind of a missed opportunity to have dual POV chapters where we get to read from both Darcy and Oliver's perspectives. That could have really made the story much more dynamic. Overall, I still enjoyed this. It was a refreshing and cathartic take on a classic story that I love. Listening to the audiobook made it such a pleasurable reading experience as well. In the end, I gave this a solid 3.5 stars. I read this first and foremost to check off the gender-bent retelling prompt, and I also put it towards the free space, which I made TBR Redemption for this round, meaning books that I had officially put on a monthly TBR sometime in 2024 but did not get to them, and so this was my chance to finally circle back. The last book I read for this round was Time's Agent by Brenda Peinado. I read from a gifted early copy, but it was since released by Tor.com back in August. This is an innovative, time-bending sci-fi novella set in the future when humankind has discovered how to access pocket universes. Our main character, Raquel, and her wife, Marlena, both used to study these pocket worlds as an archaeologist and biologist, respectively, with the hope of solving the universe's greatest mysteries. But that was 40 years ago, and now everything is completely different. Raquel is now a disgraced ex-agent, their daughter's consciousness has been installed in a robot dog, pocket worlds have been seized and commodified by corporations in every imaginable way, and her wife now lives in a pocket universe that Raquel wears around her neck. And she might just have one chance left to save something or someone from the reaches of time and finally redeem herself. Content warnings for explorations of child death and grief, brief references to colonial violence, including slavery and rape, and some experienced racism and homophobia. Also worth noting, this story takes place in the Dominican Republic. Both Raquel and Marlena are Dominican, and Marlena also has Haitian roots. This is probably the coolest book I read all week, and I don't necessarily mean coolest as in the best, although for the record, it was really freaking incredible. I just mean in terms of cool factor, in terms of that feeling you get when you open a book and you're like, oh shit, this is badass. This was badass. I love the world building of this story, how it lays out this new pocket world technology and gradually introduces the reader to all of its horrific and wondrous implications. The beginning of the story shows these characters on the very cusp of that discovery, really reveling in all the infinite possibilities. But after Raquel is trapped in a time-locked world and spit back out 40 years later, everything she once knew and once had has been violently decimated. This story explores what it calls final stage capitalism, and it is absolutely horrifying. The kind of thought that went into exploring all the ways that pocket worlds and time distortion can be commodified, commercialized, and sold is terrifyingly realistic. But most importantly, I love the metaphorical resonances of the story, how both Raquel and Marlena are constantly searching for something to fill the void through the work they do, but how they're searching in different directions. One looking for future possibilities and new ways of life, and the other rifling through the detritus of a broken past. And at its heart, this is really a story about the devastating effects of colonization. Not only how the goal of colonization is to make the colonized dependent on its own tools so that they learn how to further colonize themselves with those tools, but also how colonization destroys and degrades meaning and value, which is what makes the colonized feel so unmoored and so disconnected from their cultural inheritance in the first place. And that's because loneliness, isolation, and grief, all of which are meticulously folded together in this story, are capitalism and colonization's greatest commodities. So to me, those were the central questions of the story. How far are we willing to go to justify our complicity in the system? In what ways are we using the tools of the colonizer to knowingly or unknowingly expand the project of colonization? And if we ever find the opportunity to resist, will we be brave enough not only to do it, but even to recognize it to begin with? This was such an incredibly ambitious, mind-bending piece of speculative fiction. It was a wild ride from start to finish, and I loved every second of it. I will say some of the world building is a tad more complex than is strictly necessary, and I did find there to be a bit of a jarring tonal shift towards the end, but overall this was still definitely a new favorite. I gave it 4.5 stars. I counted this one towards the free space once again because it was also a TBR redemption title, and I also counted it towards past, present, future since the entire story is about the dilation and traversing of different timescapes. I'll take a second here to show you my completed bingo board. I made 4 bingos this round: the bottom row, the second to last column, the last column, and the diagonal with the green boxes. Reading that many books within a week is very much not my norm, so I'm really proud of myself, and I hope you're also proud of yourself if you took part, whether you read more or less. And if you want to share about what you read for the readathon, feel free to drop that down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.